Hey everyone, Dan from the Nostalgia Test podcast, and just wanted to give you a heads up that this episode we have conversations about mental health, PTSD, violence in horror movies, and suicide ideation.
On today's Nostalgia 101 episode, class is back in session with Josh Grant, who will talk all about Are You Afraid of the Dark? Here we go. Welcome to the Nostalgia Test podcast, the show where two longtime friends put their mainstream pop culture past to the ultimate test, the Nostalgia Test.
Here it is, Dan. We're back at it. I thought I left school.
No, not
me going back to school all the time. Anyways, I do love these segments. The mythology. What do we call it? Not
mythology. Shameless plug.
I'm sorry, shameless plug. Nostalgia 101.
Yeah.
This one's good. This is like almost like more focused on kind of what we do. Like, are we going to be putting some things to the test during this 101 class?
I mean,
maybe.
I think we could, and it's an interesting connection to, the episode we did with, what's the guy's name that did the Orange Years, the director of the Orange Years, and we had him on talking all about the Nickelodeon documentary. We talked a little bit about Are You Afraid of the Dark?
Yes.
And kind of the legacy behind a lot of these shows and a lot of the original material that like Nickelodeon was just coming up with. But I have so many questions for Josh, and I can't wait because there's so many other things that it reminded me of, like Scary Stories, Goosebumps, Erie, Indiana, things that like I was just like, oh my God, like there was like a whole moment of these like really great.
Dude,
shows.
I remember with these shows, they even like brought in like there was a book series that came with these like around this time because I remember reading. I specifically, for some reason, I blank out when I think about the shows. But I remember reading this, like, I don't know if it was a Goosebumps series, but I do remember reading like really scary, well, for kids.
Yeah, Scary Stories. I think it was
stories like that were very quick, like 4-page. I specifically remember this one guy who had like spiders coming out of the eye.
Yeah.
It was just like a drawing of an eye with spiders coming out.
Yeah. It was amazing.
And I remember reading it in my like sister's closet, which is weird. Because I guess it was scary to be in the closet reading it. So like,
oh my God,
I feel like I'm like transformed back in that time, like
right,
like reading it there in this like low light. So yeah, I'm excited.
I'm excited, and so why don't we bring our guest in? We are so happy for you to, that you're here. We've been emailing back and forth. Things were been a little rocky with the scheduling, but we're here. We're happy to have Josh Grant Young on the podcast. Josh, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you both for having me.
No, I mean, it's every time we do one of these, for us, it's a pleasure because it's just been so much that we've been learning about nostalgia, learning about pop culture. But yeah, why don't you let our audience know a little bit about who you are, what you do, and then we'll just jump right in.
Right, sure. So I'm a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Guelph in Canada, and I work mainly on a field of philosophy that deals with, public perceptions and representations of mental health. And I principally look at that question of how people engage with, this discussion of mental health through primarily horror film, but also horror literature and some music and television, which, we'll certainly talk about horror television today. I also used to run a film group in Guelph, Philosophy in the Dark, which was meeting periodically to watch horror films. And we'd occasionally have myself or another presenter give a talk about, either their interpretation of the film or a particularly interesting thing that was going on related to the film. And we ended up having a conference in 2019 April 2019, on the subject of horror as it related to philosophy. So that's kind of been my thing. Otherwise, I write pieces occasionally talking about horror and mental health in various publications online. And, that's more or less who I am.
Wow. Awesome. Manny, I see you're thinking, like you're sitting back, you're doing the thinking pose, and I'm like,
yeah, I'm
trying
to think about like that's a great, like, not crazy. I'm just like thinking about the correlation of horror and mental health. And are you like the study of it? Are you using it as like, is it like a therapy, or is it like how people express their mental health through horror, like telling horror stories and stuff, or like it's all of it? Like,
yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing about narrative in general, right? Is it can mean a lot of different things as a tool for people. Like you said, for some people, it can be a therapeutic way of, talking about their own personal experience or the experience of like a group of people. For other people, it might be a way to raise awareness or talk about stigma in a sort of non-traditional way. For other people, it might be, sort of shining a light on historical, issues. Like, for example, I recently, for Horror Homeroom, it's an interesting online publication I recommend people check out. They had a issue on classic horror where I talked about the movie Bedlam, which talked about the sort of historical treatment of people in mental asylums in Britain. And obviously it's a fictional movie, Boris Karloff, my bad. And yeah, it sort of touches on a very real historical problem of, how were these spaces, these asylums, founded, what kind of things did they do? And in many cases, I mean, it's not a great history in the UK or the United States or Canada. Mm-hmm. And it's a history that I think, is well worth telling. And that's sort of what I try to discuss in that piece is, how does this movie make us reflect not only on that kind of history, but also the history of the genre too, when it comes to, reflecting mental health, because it's one of those rare cases where if you look at certain movies like, Split, or you look at Lights Out, it's not the most positive message about mental health. I mean, Split, mental health is monstrosity. Yeah. Lights Out, if you have depression, you've just got to commit suicide because that's the only way to free your family of, generational trauma. On the other hand, I mean, Bedlam's got problems. It's an old movie. So, and I talk about some of those in the article. But what it does that's interesting is it turns the thing around where, usually when we think about, images of asylums in horror films, we think about, terrifying people who are, wrapped up in, straitjackets, speaking gibberish to us and, lashing violently out at people. But this is a movie where the people who are in the asylum seem to be like the most quote unquote sane individuals. Like they're just people like you and me who happen to be in the asylum. And even like the most scary, potentially violent people in the asylum turn out to be perfectly fine individuals. And it's actually, the culture around them who use them for, entertainment and use them as, a way to make a quick buck. That's where the horror is, interestingly enough. It's not in the asylum like it is with some films. It's the culture that creates the asylum is where the real horror is.
That reminds me of something like very, getting super nerdy into the theoretical part of it. Like in Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he says like the oppressor is the one who incites the violence. The oppressed doesn't incite the violence because the violence was already like incited by the oppressor. Anything that the oppressed do is in defense of the violence that's already been put on top of them. So I feel like in that case, like you're saying, like in the asylum, it's not the people in the asylum, the patients, the violence has already been incited on them by the people who have created the asylum, how they treat them, how they dehumanize them. But a lot of the times when the writers create these narratives, there is that part isn't in there, especially in like especially new film, new horror is like interesting because it is very much focused on the monster that's not like going to try and hurt someone. Not how did this happen? Where did this go wrong? What entailed to this, like it created this, right? So it's really quite interesting to think of it in those terms because it really puts the onus on the creator kind of like Frankenstein, like the you know, Frankenstein's monster, like he created this, and instead most of the time what we focus on is the monster, not the one who creates the monster, right?
Yeah, like take Halloween for example.
Yes,
I love the movie Halloween, don't get me wrong, but one of the interesting things, there's a wonderful essay in a book on mental health portrayals in media, and if I can remember where it is in my bookshelf, I can always send you a link if you're interested. But it talks about the quote unquote meme of the escaped male asylum patient that happens in slasher movies, basically from Psycho until the present, where you have a lot of times in these slasher movies, the figure like Michael Myers of pure evil who comes from where? He comes from an asylum. And in many ways, it's interesting how much you want to track that with the deinstitutionalization wave that happens, you know, in the period that sort of runs around the late 70s into the Reagan era in America. But it's fascinating in the sense that when you think about, you know, Michael Myers, I mean, so much of his, you know, persona is wrapped up in this idea of being pure evil. And it often, you know, gets sort of ignored to a certain extent that, you know, this is also someone who's an asylum patient. And it's funny to me that, you know, and other movies like Black Christmas, the retcon of that in 2009, I think.
Yeah.
Also an asylum patient.
Mm-hmm.
Jason Voorhees is not what people would call mentally ill, but he certainly has cognitive disabilities from the looks of it. You know, it's in many cases difference in these slasher movies translates into a sort of violent personality. And again, it's sort of fascinating to take a look at, you know, what this sort of says about the fears of like American suburban culture around the time of deinstitutionalization. Is, you know, why are they making movies about men particularly who are, you know, coming at it? Because I mean, there's a lot to say about women in asylums, and I don't want to brag at that, but you know, what is this figure of mental difference that people are, you know, conjuring up at this point? What does it say about the anxieties of you know, that particular moment? That's why, again, Manny's question was so interesting, is because there are so many different ways to sort of look at this through different lenses. And obviously, you know, Rob Zombie's remake of Halloween, for what it was, there was some attempt to try to explain, you know, some sort of genesis for why Michael was the way he was. You know, abusive household. But I mean, obviously not the best movie, not a great remake either. Kind of lacked a lot of what made the original great. But yeah, it's interesting to think about all these sort of different lenses of how we think about
even like Psycho, like wasn't it like he had like issues with his mom, right? And stuff. And like then I was thinking as you were talking the whole time was about Shutter Island. Although not a horror, but like a thriller. And like, you know, I don't want to spoil it, but like it basically is in this dude's head and he has mental issues because of what happened. And it's really, I'm just trying to think about like, has there been any, like, could it be horror if it ends with us feeling bad for the character we're supposed to be afraid of?
Right.
Which is, now that you're saying it, like I'm like, wow, I have not even like thought that all these people do have mental issues and we're just kind of like along for this ride of terror and like being scared of it instead of trying to like, well, how can we stop the rain without ending their life? You know, it's like, oh, there's nothing we can do. Let's just kill it. You know, and I mean, horrible to think about because that's just like, you know, the mental issues. A lot of now you see a lot of shows that are like dealing with like suicide and, you know, like there was like 13 Reasons, that movie and stuff. So like none of that, you know, like there's other genres that are trying to take care of that, but like, then how do you have a horror genre without having somebody to be like afraid of?
Mm-hmm.
I guess
yeah. I mean, so on one hand, I mean, a lot of me is wrapped up in, I think it's Jeffrey Jerome Cohen put together a book called Monster Theory, where he lays out sort of theses of what a monster is. And certainly when you look at mental health through the lens of monstrosity, like, yeah, the ending's not great, because on one hand, you're right. I mean, people with mental differences belong dead if they're monsters in the genre. But the other half of it is that the monster always comes back. It never really dies. I mean, it's going to be endlessly repeated and repeated and repeated ad infinitum. But the interesting thing is, you know, when you don't think of it necessarily just as monstrosity, possibility opens up. I mean, The Babadook was one of those movies where people sort of lauded how, you know, to sort of shift the focus from, you know, violent male anger to, you know, silenced grief of women. You know, The Babadook's interesting because you have this, you know, situation where on one hand, people were sort of wrapped up in this idea of, you know, the depiction of monstrous motherhood, you know, where, you know, she's obviously inhabited by the Babadook and violently lashes out, you know, towards her son and those around her. But I mean, it's one of those movies where maybe it's like a bittersweet ending in a certain sense, where she realizes that you can't necessarily ever rid yourself of that sort of dark aspect of yourself, but you can learn how to make peace with it, and you can learn how to live with it in a sort of constructive way. So it's, you know, the sort of therapeutic reading we're talking about, where she doesn't necessarily like conquer the monster in the way that we normally think about the genre, but she does sort of learn a way to live alongside it, recognize it exists, but nonetheless live in spite of it, because the monster is grief. The monster is, you know, trauma. So it's, you know, something that she can sort of finally name at the end of the movie and, you know, begin to live in spite of. But of course, the bittersweet part is, you know, her son asking, you know, am I ever going to get to see the monster? And she says, oh yeah, no, you'll see it, because this is, again, to go back to what I said earlier, it's never really the end.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
These things never go away.
So as we're like talking about these like horror films and ideas of monstrosity and mental health issues and how their depiction, I'm also wondering then, like, something like Are You Afraid of the Dark, which was created for kids, right? It's a Nickelodeon series, it's created for kids. How does Are You Afraid of the Dark fit into the picture? Not, I guess, like specifically in the specific conversation, but when it comes to horror, is there something that Are You Afraid of the Dark did or still does today that that certain horror isn't doing? Or like, what was it about it that you think made it so big or so important?
Right. So, I mean, I'm going to sort of hash out some stuff that's been covered by other people before in a certain respect. So, I mean, if you, for example, want to read Matt Mellis's essay at Consequence TV on, it's rather short. It's more of a list of, you know, the best episodes. And you can certainly agree or disagree with his list. And Gabrielle Moss's article on Sci-Fi. So, I mean, I'll start with Gabrielle's essay because in many ways she's talking about a sort of enduring question of horror where, you know, horror in a certain sense, like for a lot of people, like many genres in a certain way, it's for the boys, right? And she wants to say, well, no, I mean, when you think about Are You Afraid of the Dark, this is one of those cultural moments when it started to feel like okay to be a woman or a girl and like horror and see yourself in it. So, I mean, she talks about, you know, this idea that when you look at this TV show, like it opens up a lot of different issues. But I mean, you know, it talks about a lot of female experiences directly. She says, it talks about being bullied by other girls or having, guys resent the fact that you exist in a space that should be guys only, and it doesn't have to always be about boys' fears. She says, it could be about, girls' fears and problems too, and where they get to be, I think she says, like, the imperfect heroes as often as boys do. And it's a show where, like, even in the first season, you go down the list, half of the scripts focus on female characters, and a lot of them are written by women. Which, I mean, that's pretty good, I would say, for 1990s television. If that opens up the possibility for, young women and girls to, like, turn around and say, like, yeah, like, I enjoy horror. I see myself in horror. Like, I think that's great. And I guess to sort of speak to the wider context, sort of follow Matt, he talks about this idea that, when you look at, the show, a lot of times it's talking about bullying, it's talking about peer pressure, what it's like to be a new kid or, like, sort of the outcast or loner. There's discussions of disability in certain episodes, and, kids experiencing what it's like to have family members die or parents going through divorce. And I think the most interesting thing, as he says, is that, when you look at a lot of these shows, like, the real sort of hard hitting thing in it, even when I watched through them after reading his essay, I couldn't help but feel this was a compelling point. How isolated, like, all the kids are from adults who are capable of caring about them, defending them, doing anything to support them. They're pretty much, like, on their own 90% of the time. Yeah. parents are either, like, they've fucked off somewhere, or they're, kind of jerks, or they're even the evil ones who are basically the ones preying on kids. So, he makes the point, like, in the 90s, like, we remember all this stuff about, like, oh yeah, like, if you're in trouble, like, go tell an adult. Like, adults are the people to go to. And he makes the point, like, this show flips that logic on its head, where it makes you think, well, like, do I always have the ability to trust adults? I mean, that's the sort of, like, interesting aspect of horror in some cases with this show, is that, because we grew up in this sort of, like, on one hand, don't talk to strangers, but on the other hand, always seek out the help of adults because they're the dependable, solid, like, totally trustworthy people that we can always rely on. And I mean, let's be real. Parents fail us. Adults in authority misuse their authority. And that's kind of horrific in its own right, that, you can live that experience in the real world and, like, recognize, like, adults are not always the people we hope they are. They're not always the trustworthy, affirmative, good people they should be. And that's terrifying growing up. Very real.
It makes me think of just even the all the movies and shows that, like, are just, like, a group of friends who, like, have to rely on one another. Like, I mean, when you look at it, like Stephen King's It, all their parents, all their families are totally messed up. They have to rely on one another. There's no one else that can help them but themselves. The adults don't believe them. They can't see what's going on. And so, like, there's that reliance on each other. And in Are You Afraid of the Dark, it's like this association, this group that seems like, after you explain it, it doesn't seem as innocuous, like just this group that comes together and tells these stories, but they have, like, they have rituals and ceremony. They have, just, like, a whole, like, counter, like, subculture that they've created in this one space. It's really quite interesting. Wow. Manny, did you want to say something? I'm sorry. I think I cut you right off when you were.
No, I'm taking it all in. I was going to bring up a comparison to, like, now, if you look at Stranger Things and how that, you know, because it's a nostalgic show, but trying to also be current. So like we're watching stuff that's supposed to reflect the 80s horror and thriller. And so you do have the asylum, right? And they're supposed to be superheroes in a way. And both the horror and the hero were born in a way out of this asylum, right? You know, Dan, have you seen the show?
No, not yet. I know I'm like one of like two people that have not seen this show yet. That and Cobra Kai.
I don't know how you haven't watched Cobra Kai either. How do you host a show called the Nostalgia Test?
Dude, I have a whole other
oh my god
stuff that
I don't even want to go further now because like
no, keep going, dude. It's okay.
Josh, going. Have you seen the whole you're up to date? So like to me, like it's crazy when you said that and when you were going through all the different depictions of what we've seen is the monster and how male monster, and now how 11 could be seen as a monster in the beginning by certain people, but perceived as a hero by others. And even to herself, she was struggling of whether she's the hero or the monster. Yeah. In every season, she's struggling with that issue. Like she has issues. And she's trying to figure out how to deal with those mental issues to turn it around and be the hero in her story, which is also crazy that they're able to still keep a horror, but also uplifting stories that are going on. Like you're cheering for these people. They're like such a good. I feel like it's one of the better shows like written. I thought they kind of like lost me on season like when she became like a punk rocker in a way and she like left and I was like nah, okay, but like this season they got me back. It was like yes, you know, I was all for it, and all the different like throwbacks to all the different, you know, Carrie and just like every single genre of every single movie that you could probably like, oh, that's from that movie, that's from this movie, and that, you know, it is interesting you're saying that, like how we've been programmed as, especially like our generation, that like monsters come from the asylum. Like that's not a great place. Like you drive by it, like you don't want to be with those people, but like those people might be like the ones that need the most help. But like it's a circle that just keeps going because no one wants to help them, because by help that's scary, but they only are becoming more and more scary because you're not helping them. Which goes back to also with Glass, where the girl who was abducted by, you know, Split's character, she was compassionate with the main guy, the guy that had the issue, forget his name. And she wanted him to like get help so that he wouldn't deal with all these monsters inside and that he actually could, you know, be better. But then the adults and the crazy people in the movie caused him to be worse. Like, so, man, it's just a circle that it just like doesn't end, because like you said, like the monster will never go away, whether it be like upon on themselves or other people are constantly keeping the monster like alive, like there's coming out.
And there's something to be said about like even horror that's like that's story centered, right? Like something like Are You Afraid of the Dark and The Twilight Zone and Tales from the Crypt, like they all are centered around that idea. Like you sit down, you're going to hear a story, and it's like that oral tradition of like storytelling, and it's also like you in a story you're supposed to learn something. There's someone's telling it. What are they bringing with them that they're telling this story, right? Like what is at the core of this story? And I always felt like horror like that was scary, but it was interesting because like though I might be afraid of something, I'm enjoying that scare much more than like this movie that's coming out that like there are posters everywhere and it's just like it makes
smile.
I can't. That ruins my. I watched that trailer and it ruined my day when I went to go.
I didn't watch the trailer, but I heard like the marketing is insane because they have people like going to like baseball games
No.
and standing behind the home plate and like
No.
just smiling and stuff.
No. See,
Yeah.
that to me makes it like you were saying, Josh, like the idea of like the monster being someone who has like this like depiction of mental health and like people who have mental health issues. And then it's like it creates such a warped sense of our reality that like I need to be afraid of people, where like in Are You Afraid of the Dark? I'm afraid, but I'm also know at the end the story's over. We put the fire out. We walk home. There's something of like a reality, like a world outside of what I'm doing. Do you know
Actually,
what I mean?
I forgot about Are You Afraid of the Dark? Like, does it end happy? Any of the stories, or like they just kind of like they do?
Yeah.
So there's
I
kind
mean,
of
some
like
certainly do. Yeah.
yeah.
And to sort of speak to Dan's point, I mean, yeah, the interesting thing, you're right about a lot of these anthology series is, you know, in some cases, these are morality plays. I mean, they are teaching you a certain lesson sometimes. I mean, there's one episode where one of the characters stole something from another one of them. It's foggy. I've watched so many of them that they blurred into one. But yeah, one of the characters has taken something from one of his siblings, I believe. And, you know, the story is sort of like a morality tale on like why it's wrong essentially to treat your sibling like crap. And the resulting ending of the story is, you know, this person gives back what they had taken from this. So there's elements of that. But yeah, like, so I don't know. I'll put my cards on the table. I'm somebody who, you know, certainly deals with a lot of mental health issues. Like, don't have to list them off, but suffice to say, I've got stakes in this. This is a very personal project for me because as a horror fan who grew up watching, you know, everything from, you know, the early Paramount monster movies and, you know, early depictions of like mad scientists and, you know, evil psycho killers to like even now when I, you know, go to the theater and watch, you know, new movies. And I have seen the trailer for Smile, and I'm worried. And that's no surprise. I'm a little bit worried about it. Yeah, it's a personal thing because, you know, I've said it in other pieces that I've written. You know, when you're someone who, you know, deals with things like, you know, depression or psychosis or PTSD, or you have family members who, you know, have dissociative identity issues. When you're watching an entire culture like make a spectacle out of your lived experience, and the lessons are be terrified, like Dan said, or, you know, these are monsters that we have to fear, or these are people who need to be locked up. You know, it gets tiresome at a certain point where, you know, you start to really question why you love the thing that you love so much when every time you look at it, the more and more you look at it, like, God damn, I see all the wrong. Because, like, yeah, like I'm a big white dude. Slap a hockey mask or any mask on me and walk me down the street. Yeah. People are going to be terrified. I mean, people are already probably not comfortable sometimes if they knew who I was. You know, I mean, people are already uncomfortable around, you know, unhoused people. You know, they're terrified because they're, you know, talking to them in the streets and they don't understand what they're saying. And there's enough stigma around being unhoused, never mind also having mental issues. And, you know, that's one thing. But yeah, then there's also the fact, you know, to sort of go back to that, you know, meme of the escaped mental patient. I mean, obviously I'm not someone who recently broke out of an asylum, but if people knew what I dealt with sometimes, they'd be terrified. And, you know, I don't fault them entirely because look at the media that we take in every day. I mean, it's,
sure.
Yeah,
I don't totally blame them. And obviously, you know, I don't know if Smile is going to be a good movie on that front because, you know, but I will reserve my judgment until I watch it.
Do you think that, like, people in the horror genre, like the people that make these movies, do you think they like purposely know this, or they're just kind of like they have no idea that this is actually affecting or showing bad light on this. They're just like so happy about a genre that they've been following a formula that they don't even know that they're part of this like issue.
I mean,
you know, like,
could, yeah,
you know,
could
like
split a bunch of different ways.
Because like, yeah, maybe some people are very aware of it, and they're just using it as, you know, like I said, like, so this might be therapy to people. Like, hey, I'm going to make a movie. I have issues. I'm going to make a movie because this is what I think, and at least it's fake. And I'm going to scare the crap out of people because this is what my brain thinks, and this is how I go to sleep. And my nightmares, I needed them to come true so that I can go to sleep, because I was able to portray my nightmares on screen, you know. And then they're like, thank God. And then they go to the next thing, and you know, it's a constant therapy. Like, you know, I'm gonna say my issues. When I was younger, I suffered with depression, and talking about it helped me. So like, constantly, like, don't hold things in anymore. If something's really bothering me, I tell people, or I tell people, oh, leave me alone. I'm not feeling good. You like, maybe this is their way, some people's way. Not saying it's the best way, but like, it could be an expression of certain people who have issues, and this is their way to do it. But then, you know, you're right. Like, you're also conjuring up other people's experiences without even knowing. Like, I just heard in an article today, I don't know if you saw that, there's a Dahmer
like another one
show.
like we have to deal with that again,
and the victims weren't told that the show was coming out,
and the
victims' families. And you know, Netflix, like, we didn't offend anybody, but they're like, that's not the problem. We got over things, and now the whole world is seeing what we went through. Like, they freaking lived this. Like, we have no idea what that's like. You talk about PTSD, like, these people are about to, like, even if they don't want to watch it, just seeing the preview of a dude that looks like that dude that destroyed their lives must be such like a mindfuck to them. Like, it's crazy. Like, well, I know a guy who had PTSD he never told me what it was from, but like, he constantly was suffering, and he would always like bring it up, and like has to constantly, he has 2 kids, and he has to deal with it and like go away if it comes back. Because when he was younger, I think he came from a very troubled home, and he doesn't want it to repeat. But he told me, he's like, it's a constant struggle. Like, you were talking about the monster. He's like, I don't want that monster to come out to my kids because I grew up with it, and I don't want to be that monster to them. And I'm like, wow, this is like, you know, like, our generation wasn't used to that because it was not put under the rug. I mean, I guess we all started kind of talking about it, but as you're saying, if it just normalized on television to be scared of these people, then it becomes normal without even knowing. It's like, oh yeah, no, a person talking in the middle of the street, instead of like helping or like, you know, maybe gearing them to a specialist, you're just like, yeah, get away. I don't want to deal with you. Like, continue being crazy. We're not going to deal with it, you know?
And I think, like, you know, someone who is experiencing something like that, if they do make a film in a genre, in the horror genre, they have an empathy that then comes out in the film. So though it's in horror, there is a perspective that we don't see, right? There's something that happens where you're just like, that turn, it does more of a turn where like, you're like, I didn't think of it that way. There's an empathy towards the humanity of a human being, of a person, instead of like a strict horror film that's there where you're just like, this is horror, we're making people scared of this, and then that's that. I think that's why I like anthology series. Like, there's something about an anthology series that I love, because it's like, you're getting a short burst, but they're storytellers, and like the oral tradition of storytelling to me is like, when it's portrayed back onto film or on a show like Nickelodeon's Are You Afraid of the Dark, you have someone you have there's a different filter because it's an anthology. You're telling a story, and that, to me, the storytelling aspect changes.
You also have to see where that came from. Like you said, there was women directors who were trying to tell stories from a different point of view, and maybe also wanted to like get a lesson out of it. If you're just a horror guy who doesn't care about lessons,
there's plenty.
You're just going to say whatever. Like even Bird Box. Now that you're saying it, what if you watched Bird Box? Wasn't it that the people that didn't get affected were ones that had issues?
I don't
like
remember.
they were like making it like,
right, yeah.
Like they were like making it like the people who had mental issues or like talk to themselves weren't affected by the evil somehow. Like they weren't able to turn. Like they were able to look at the evil and not like turn somehow.
Yeah,
it was like this whole thing, like they basically were saying that like, yeah, somebody who had issues, you had to be scared of them too. Like I'm just like, thinking about how crazy that genre is. Wow.
I mean, I don't want to throw horror under the bus.
No.
Oh no, it's
no. I'm just thinking it's
yeah. Go
what
ahead.
I'm saying is I like I guess supernatural horror. Like I like horror. Like my favorite thing is more of thrillers. Like when you don't see the problem, but somehow the director can make you scared of certain things that are going, like Friday the 13th, the original movie. I know it's like the mom was the issue, but like most of that was like camera work.
Yeah.
And like you're like, what? You know, you were just so scared of like what you didn't see. And I think that's like extremely amazing horror because like now you're in your own brain and you're causing something to be scared of. Now, what Dan could be scared of might be different than what I'm scared of, but we're both reacting to that movie, but thinking about a different being or alien or virus, whatever it might be, but you're like, the jolts are like what's scary to me. Like that's hard to me.
Yeah.
But
it's like, you know, when I think about it, obviously, like, you know, the comedy genre is played on a number of tropes involving mental difference. You know, in romantic movies, it's quirky, it's fun, it's weird, you know, it's a little variety is the spice of life in that case. You know, it's not only the horror genre. I mean, it's a wider cultural thing, right? I mean, even in our political rhetoric, I mean, every time there's a goddamn mass shooting in Canada or the United States, or there's, you know, some sort of situation where, you know, someone who is struggling with some mental issues happens to commit, you know, the statistically highly unlikely act of violence. You know, these people are branded as monsters. I mean, Donald Trump was called the monsters. My own premier is, you know, referred to people as monsters, you know, and so it's in our politics. It's in our media, you know, it's in, you know, the way that we relate to one another on the street. It's not like a, you know, singular problem in one genre or one way of telling a story. It's just a general sort of thing in Western culture that we've still had a lot of problems reckoning with.
I think it's more than just Western culture. I think like the whole world, like there's plenty of, you know, other cultures that look at mental illness as like almost like a deficiency.
Sure.
In a way. They almost like don't even talk about it because they're just like, you don't exist because this is you have an issue. Let me ask you this just to kind of flip things up. So you like the genre. What's your favorite like movie that like still like you still really like that kind of horror? Okay. Like what is your favorite?
So it's going to be a strange answer, but here we go. So there's a movie from Japan called House. Yeah, Houseu, yeah.
Okay.
And it's probably one of the weirdest movies you'll ever watch, particularly if you're under the influence when you do. Which I recommend watching both sides if you do that kind of thing when you watch movies, but because you want to watch it sober at least once to really take in how weird the movie is on its own. But yeah, it's a movie about a haunted house at its very base core, but there's also cats with laser beams coming out of their eyes, pianos that eat people.
Oh my god!
So basically, the video from what's that?
Total Eclipse of the Heart.
Total Eclipse of the Heart.
Yeah.
Yes, but also if it was shot like a Pepsi commercial.
Oh my god, that is hilarious!
It's a wild ride. So
wow.
And it's a horror. It's considered horror.
It is considered a horror movie because there's obviously like an evil force within the house that is trying to prey on a group of young women from Japan.
Okay.
And their attempts to escape the house. It's a very weird movie.
Did they try to remake this in an American version? I feel like they did something like that. I thought they did something with the house that
house
they're kind of trapped. They're trapped in and stuff like that. Yeah, there's stuff like that. But so you like it? Do you like this genre because of how it can be somewhat cheesy? Do you like this movie because of that it was a little bit of cheesy, or is it suspenseful and actually scary as fuck?
So I mean, it's got a couple elements, right? On one hand, I love good cheese. I love movies like The Stuff. Or street trash. I love garbage movies. I'm not afraid to say it. But at the same time, too, I also really enjoy the fact that it's sort of an alternate take on thinking about the structure of the haunted house and what it means, and it takes it out of traditionally when we think about haunted house stuff, we're thinking about the European Gothic or. That's what a lot of the movies tend to focus on. Not entirely, but a lot of times. But it's one of those movies where it's set in Japan, but it's also just very earnestly weird, and in a way that I find very endearing. Because of course, I love movies like The Shining. I love movies like. The Wolfman and Frankenstein. I love Nosferatu. I've talked about the Golem with people before. And obviously, slasher movies are great too. I've Giallo movies for all of their different things. I'm pretty eclectic with my horror. And you said Shutter Island, it's a thriller, but I'd agree with you. I'm a big tent person when it comes to horror. So I would be happy to include Shutter Island in the horror genre or horror adjacent if people aren't comfortable with it being a horror.
Yeah, movie. I guess when I call it thriller, it's just I think is more about I guess it's called thriller to get more seats and more people in the seats, right? Because when you say horror, there is that's a really niche section of people who want to watch horror, but you say thriller, people are oh, I'll go see that. It's not much about ghosts or anything. I'll go. So my wife hates horror, but she'll sit through some thriller,
sure,
up to a point, and then closes her eyes most of the time. But I definitely think there's a fine line in a good thriller / horror, because I was pretty terrified during that movie. I thought it was done really well.
Yeah, it's a great movie.
Yeah.
There's also a very thin line between a horror film that is well done, even with its gore and it's scary and stuff like that, and then this is the thing, because you said music, and I was thinking I'm a huge heavy metal fan, and the thing about metal is it's very influenced by horror, obviously. But the thing about metal and metal fans is, and I feel like horror fans are like this too, is that we start looking for the hardest, most metal, most fast, most thing. And then when we find our threshold, we kind of almost are reflecting how did I get to this moment? Because I remember now I don't listen to metal as much anymore, because I'm just I don't know if I could take this in anymore as much as I used to. Or I'll listen to certain bands like Iron Maiden, which is a metal band, but it's not in that lower key, right? It does not in that lower key, but I just there's just like when I think of horror, the horror that I want to watch, I'm more or less going to be like maybe more anthology series stuff or more stuff that's like going to be a good story. Because I feel like you said something really interesting in the beginning of the podcast, and I know we kind of have to wrap up, but there's something about, like you said, about like how in Are You Afraid of the Dark, there's something about women being empowered, and there's like an empowering space there for women and girls and things like that. Not just like being a part of the genre, but also when I think of it, I'm like being a little safer in the genre. Because if you're a woman in a horror film, most of the time, like there's not a lot of safety for you in that space. Like you're mainly running for your life a lot of the times in these films. And a lot of the times now, especially after that movie Hostel came out, when that came out, a lot of the movies were just around like capture someone and it's like torture them. And I got to watch that for about an hour. And that was a lot to sit through. Do you feel like horror is like hopefully making a turn away from things like that soon? Like cause I don't watch as many, but like there was like a really moment where like torture horror and that like idea of like capture someone, do something to them and like watch it for an hour, or the found footage films. There's like a movie, there's a lot of films that are like that and are just terrifying. But they're not terrifying like Blair Witch, where there was nothing there. It was all in your brain. But now it's like, forget that. We're going to take whatever's in their head and put it in front of them. Like, is there a turn coming, or do you feel like people are turning away from stuff like that, or do you think it's just getting amped up more and more?
I mean, so I guess when I look at online spaces, I'm seeing more women. I'm seeing, people talking from the Black experience, talking from Asian American experiences, talking from a number of different perspectives. And, to me, like that's a great sign, because, to sort of go back to the idea of storytelling and why it matters, I gotta say, like, some of the stuff that I'm really enjoying right now is, stuff that isn't just like, I'm not watching Eli Roth, not to pick on Eli Roth. Sorry, Eli, but I'm not, I'm not watching like, your typical white guy story about like scary stuff going on. Like, I want to know what anxieties or what fears or what aspirations too, because I mean, it's not just about, brutality and murder and death. There's also, a lot of stuff wrapped up in this. I mean, that's why I love, people like Jordan Peele.
Yeah, I was going to
something so different with the genre. And the same with, when I read think pieces by women and think pieces from people from different, backgrounds. It's like, reading queer new ways of looking at this movie, or, here's a take on why, this particular horror film, is sort of making us rethink the relationship, between Black Americans and horror. Like, that's beautiful stuff. And I think, we're in a period where this conversation is happening, and like, obviously it's a process. And I've seen a lot of people doing some great work, and a lot of the spaces I travel in the horror community online, that's making a big impact. So I'm really happy to see that. I mean, the ultimate litmus test is like the public who watches these movies. Like, are they going to buy those tickets and sit in those seats? I mean, it's ultimately like I hate to be a sort of like brutal market thinker here about it, but
you're right.
Is the public gonna pay money to go see it? God, I hope so, because without going to see these movies, I mean, you kind of miss a lot of great narratives. I mean, that's to sort of wrap up on the Are You Afraid of the Dark? Which, by the way, was nominated for an NAACP. Was it Insight or Impact Award? I can't remember the name of it.
Like recently?
Image Award. Yeah, 1996.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's important for, spaces to open up for people to tell stories. And I mean, I'm not here to compare, my experience to any of the other people that I've mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's worthwhile to think about, just like with any other genre, how do we open up spaces? How do we create our own sort of, affirmative midnight society club? Which, obviously the kids talk shit to each other. They weren't always buddy. But at the end of the day, like, it was a space for a bunch of outcasts with very different backgrounds to come together and share something that they really enjoyed and to grow through it. And I only hope that, if there's one enduring thing that people might take away from things like Are You Afraid of the Dark going forward in the horror communities, like, how do you expand that, circle around the flame,
Wow. That's, I think, a great spot to just.
Yeah, I can't
put a period on
better than myself. Yeah.
That was Josh. Thank you so much for being on and for sharing your ideas and sharing with the audience about, your experiences and everything. I feel like every time Manny and I do this, these types of episodes, we just walk away just like having learned a ton, and also just grateful for the guests to come on and make time to do this, because, this type of episode doesn't exist without someone to come on and teach us. So thank you for that. And thank you for doing the work out there that you're doing. I can't wait to read some of the stuff you're doing, but wow. I mean, everybody, please leave your comments, leave your questions, follow the podcast, and let us know what you think. Manny.
I can't top that. So
well, I'm grateful
for coming through. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I'm grateful for being here too. Because for me, it's an opportunity to, talk through stuff that I think about every day and have the opportunity to share, and learn from other people's insights about this. And it's been great, kind of therapeutic.
Absolutely. Well,
No, I was going to ask him. You were talking about Peele, and you were saying you like his way of, like, I've only seen one of his movies. I saw Get Out, and he's recently did Nope or something like that. It was called Nope. Did you see it?
I did, yeah.
Was it good?
I loved it.
You did?
Okay. And yeah, I'm not even bullshitting here. Like, I think it's a really rich movie in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Okay. There's some people, like, I've seen like reviewers on like social media, and some people weren't really into it. I guess they're like kind of new to the genre, and they're kind of getting, I guess they don't like his formula anymore, or they were like expecting Get Out, and they're not, they're just kind of growing tired or something. So I just kind of wanted to hear it from you. So I kind of want to see it. I did enjoy Get Out. I thought it was crazy. And like that, like you talk about fears, like that's a whole other, like, I'm a white dude. I don't know what other people's fears are. And like, that was a whole interesting world to be in. And it was fantastic. I thought it was such a good movie. So,
well,
yeah,
everybody, thank you so much. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being here. And everybody, follow the podcast, subscribe to the podcast, and let us know what you want next. Maybe on the next Nostalgia 101. We have some guests coming up. This series is going on. This is it. We're going to continue this series and the other episodes where Manny and I scream about whatever and talk about horrible toys or something. But Arnold, this has been
what did we just redo? A Palmer episode?
Oh, we're releasing an episode on Robert Palmer. It's out already. Yeah, Robert Palmer.
So we just did a whole thing about Nostalgia 101 on horror, but Robert Palmer's coming.
Robert Palmer. We're listening to Robert Palmer. So everybody, thank you so much for being here. Josh, thank you so much for being here. And we'll see you in the next Nostalgia 101 episode.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. Please subscribe to the Nostalgia Test podcast to know when new episodes drop. Don't forget to leave us 5 stars and a positive review so more people can find the podcast. Share your thoughts and memories on today's topic on our Twitter @NostalgiaTest and on Instagram @TheNostalgiaTest. Tune in next time because you never know what pop culture will pop up on The Nostalgia Test.